Hello, everybody.
Good morning, or good evening, or whatever time it is where you're tuning in from. I'm Alice Stevens.
Marcy Cabrera Canciabello.
And welcome to the first Adoptee Literary Festival, where the adoptee is the subject of their own story. This is a do-it-yourself, all-volunteer event. Thanks to our sponsors, partners, and all the participants and volunteers for making this hugely important event happen. Thank you to the attendees for coming. Our mission is to empower adoptees to write their own stories and thereby reframe the adoption narrative. Adoptees, you have the right to tell your own story. Adoptees, this is our time.
I want to mention also that we, as a festival, we wanted to make it accessible and free for everyone. So we are really grateful to you for coming. None of this would have been really possible without attendees really making it all worth it too. So I'm joining from Miami, Florida, which is the traditional land of the Seminole, Miccosukee, and Tequesta people. I want to acknowledge this and honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. We have disabled the chat, but we'll be dropping information in and links throughout. We also are trying to get the captioning working, which should appear at the bottom of your screen soon as an option if you want to get a live transcript. We will be recording this for an archival purposes, and any registered attendees will get information after the festival about it. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so we will be doing an audience Q&A afterward, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So feel free to drop your questions into that Q&A box throughout the event. I also would love to thank our sponsors, Loyalty Bookstore, our local independent bookseller that is also adoptee owned. We also want to thank our other partners and sponsors, Pan America, Miami's South Florida chapter, Adoptees On, Adoptee Voices, Adoption Knowledge Affiliates, also known as the Starlings Collective, and the Washington Independent Review of Books. And we are really grateful to all of you, and thanks to our volunteers who have made this possible. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to our moderator, J.S. Lee, the author of the novels Everyone Was Falling and Kurium. Her essays and op-eds have appeared in Yes Magazine, Health.com, and more. Please give a round of virtual applause to J.S. Lee.
Hi, thank you so much, Marcy and Alice, and we all owe you both a big thanks for dreaming up this Lit Fest and making it happen. I know it's been a labor of love, and thanks to those of you who are tuning in. It's bright and early here in California, but I'm glad to be part of this event. So, as many of you know, the topic of adoption has historically been dominated by adopters, adoption agencies, non-adopted academics, therapists, social workers, writers, filmmakers, and more. Even those well-meaning tend to speak over us, pathologize, co-opt, simplify, objectify, and further strip us of agency. So this panel is about owning the adoptee narrative. There are so many brilliant members in our community who've been doing great work for a really long time. So it is a privilege to be able to highlight a few who are with us here today, starting with Melissa Guida-Richards, author, adoptee advocate, and podcaster, whose work has appeared in a variety of publications, and her book, What White Parents Should Know About Transracial Adoption, is a much needed guide meant to serve adoptees by way of educating adoptive parents. Seth Berkman, journalist, author, and pickleballer, is author of a beautiful book called A Team of Their Own, which details the stories of South Korea's first women's Olympic hockey team, and he's a contributor to the New York Times. And then there's Stephanie Drenka, storyteller, activist, and creator. She is the founding editor of Visible Magazine, and I've enjoyed her honest, informative essays for years. Her photography and writing has been featured in the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and beyond. I'm not sure if you all have your cameras turned on. But let's just jump right in with Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, I'm so glad that we could do this.
Me too. So I wanted to tell you, as I was reading what my parents should know about transracial adoption, I was nodding along to every word. So much great stuff in there. And as you know, as adoptees, as women of color, we are constantly being tone policed. So it was really cool to see you did not sacrifice your strong voice for the sake of being palatable. And I also really love your essays. You're really prolific.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what would you like to read for us this morning?
Okay, this is one of my favorite essays. It's called Like Colin Kaepernick, I Wish My Adoptive Family Had Talked About Race. And I wrote it for HuffPo back in October. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs. When I was adopted from Colombia in 1993, my parents were one of many that believed in this colorblind ideology. The adoption agency they used and what they learned about adoption from the media made them believe that giving a child a loving home was all that was necessary. So for most of my life, we didn't talk about my race and ethnicity to the extent that I was not aware of my true racial identity until I was 19 and found paperwork confirming my adoption. My parents firmly believed that if they raised me as Latina, I would be treated differently than the rest of my family. The unfortunate reality is that despite their plans to ignore race, it still became an issue. Not talking about race made me very aware when people questioned where I was from, particularly when my family wasn't around. When I was out with my white parents, I was included under their umbrella of privilege. But the moment I was out there on my own, people treated me differently. Many BIPOC adoptees eventually learned that the world is divided into how we are perceived with our families versus alone. And this is especially true in today's climate, where an Asian adoptee shopping for groceries can be attacked, a Black adoptee pulled over by police is potentially in danger, or a Latina adoptee walking in town is told to go back to their own country. Adoptive families can think that it will never happen to their child, but for most of us, it does. It's just part of the reality of being a person of color.
Wow, that is totally perfect. I related to so much of that. So I just wanted to talk about your book for a minute here. I have a few guesses, but I would love to hear what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, so after finding out I was adopted, I had so many conversations with my parents, my adoptive parents, and we kept butting heads. And there was this moment where we were several years into the same conversations, and I was looking at them across the kitchen table, and I just wondered, like, why weren't they prepared? Like, why did they like really not know how race and ethnicity and how culture held such an impact for adoptees, especially adoptees of color? And I decided like maybe there was resources out there. So I started looking, and I found nothing written by an adoptee. Most of the resources out there was written by adoptive professionals or adoptive parents. And as you can probably imagine, they highlighted certain things that were more palatable. So I had been advocating for a few years already about just sharing the nuances of adoption. And I was like, maybe I need to do this because no one else is. And so I put together a proposal and sent it out, and now here we are. And I'm so glad that it's been so well received.
Amazing. I am so glad you did it too, because I've received a lot of just random notes from adoptive parents asking me just because they've read something that I've written. So now I can point them to you.
Thank you.
Your book. So I have to ask, given the target audience, how do you handle the inevitable negative feedback?
Yeah, so when I first went viral back in like 2019 by sharing my adoption story, I was inundated by like so many emails, like really lengthy pages long emails from like adoptive parents, strangers who were just connected to adopting, and even adoptees. And I was surprised that by the passion behind some of those. And at first I was very overwhelmed and I really didn't know what to do. So I would just read them and be like, oh no, did I do something wrong? But as time has gone by and like I've kept writing and advocating, I've seen a pattern where when I share my story, people get defensive. And at first I used to take it a little personally because it felt very like personal when people would look at my story and criticize me for just sharing what had happened in my life, especially when I had like the full support of my adoptive parents to share. But over time, I've realized that there are always going to be those people who are going to have an opinion. And everybody is allowed an opinion, but that doesn't mean that I have to welcome them into my space. So I make sure that on my platforms, especially like my Instagram, where I always encourage a lot of conversation, that there's like a rule. It's like I encourage discussing the nuance, but we're not going to be rude. We're not going to call people names. We're not going to try to invalidate someone else's story, such as another adoptee sharing in the comments. And I try to restrict people who are just not going to follow those things and then block very freely and just, you know, do the best to realize that I need to make a safe space for me. I need to make a safe space for adoptees, and it's going to take some policing.
Yeah, I mean, protecting our space is so important. Boundaries are so important, especially since so many of us are infantilized regularly by the, especially adoptive parents. So good for you. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So I will come back to a bigger conversation, but I want to speak with Seth for a minute here. I don't see him. Hi, Seth. Are you there?
Hey, yeah.
Hi. So I wanted to tell you that I adored your book, A Team of Their Own. I appreciated learning about the team's challenges and the way you wove in history so well, but mostly I really loved reading about these strong young Korean women and their sisterhood. That was a big surprise for me, even though you have in the subtitle Sisterhood. So do you want to read some piece of it for us?
Yeah, I'm going to read a short excerpt and just set it up a bit. It's taking place, the South Korean women's hockey team, they would come to the US every so often to kind of train. And so they would have these training camps in Minnesota. And so I followed the team on one trip where they were having a series of games throughout the state. And I noticed the connection that the team was having with families of adoptees, but also kind of Korean Americans who were living in the area who really didn't know anything about the team, but were kind of drawn to come see them play. While being a Korean hockey player in America had its share of cringe-inducing moments, it was in the US where the players often demonstrated why it was worthwhile for the South Korean government to fully invest in women's hockey. Desiree and Steve Rembeck, a young Caucasian couple from the Twin Cities, brought their two sons to watch South Korea play Minnesota. 7-year-old Simon Minwon Rembeck was adopted at 22 months, while his younger brother, 5-year-old Archer Jaewon Rembeck, arrived when he was 35 months old. Desiree Rembeck had read articles about the importance of children seeing themselves in various influential figures, like how Michelle Kwan was inspired by watching the Olympic gold medal performance of Kristi Yamaguchi. Cognizant of this effect, Desiree took her sons to Minnesota Twins baseball games after they signed South Korean slugger Byung-hyo Park in 2016 and to the women's hockey game. The Rembeck boys did not know anything about Jung Shi-yoon or Lee Yoon-ji, but once inside the arena, they begged their parents for miniature South Korean flags and ran after the players for autographs. When the Rembecks returned home, they stored these mementos in a special trunk alongside the baby clothes the boys wore when they arrived in the US and other reminders of their birth country. Similar to how the Rembecks felt drawn to support South Korea's women's hockey team, Molly McCormick brought 30 students from the school where she worked as a teacher. The Sejong Academy opened in 2014 as a Korean immersion charter school intended to target adoptees from South Korea. For weeks after the game, the children showed off their pictures, pucks, and autographs they received from the players. It was an experience they will never forget, said McCormick.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, before I read your book, I'm not much of a sports fan, so I didn't realize that there were Korean adoptees on the team. Just the process of being in so much contact with Korean nationals and Korean adoptees for this book, I'm wondering if there were any, nice surprises or challenges that brought up for you.
Yeah, one of the players, Marissa Brent, who was adopted from South Korea and raised in Minnesota, she was actually kind of one of the first players that I met and immediately felt very comfortable in talking to her. And I think the reason for that was both of us sort of had the same approach or just way that we had dealt with or kind of handled adoption in our lives. And to explain that a bit is this fact that we were both sort of distant from it at a time, but in following Marissa, I could definitely see being a part of this opportunity. The South Korean team essentially recruited her. They found out that she was living in the US and played hockey, and so gave her this opportunity to join the national team. And so it was really interesting to watch her journey as she, in a way, sort of dipped her toes in the pool and started to go a bit deeper and deeper as she started to learn more about the country where she was born, and then also interact with, South Korean girls. Some of them were her age, some of them were a bit younger, and talking to her about how, eventually she would think about, oh, would my life be like theirs if I had grown up there? Or how would my life maybe be different if I had grown up in this different kind of circumstance? And one thing more so kind of culturally that was challenging a bit, I guess you could say, was a lot of the team, half the team were teenagers, so they were still in high school. And I knew going in that they studied English. It's a requirement just about for every student to take English classes. So I thought that they were very fluent and it would be easy to talk to them and interview them, minus the age gap, of course. But I was like, oh, I can relate to teenagers. I have TikTok and things like that. But it wasn't, because it took me a while to learn. And it was actually some older players who told me, even though they get straight A's in English class in Korean school, they were all really shy and embarrassed to kind of speak it. And even around English speaking players on the team, they never felt really comfortable speaking to them in English. So that was one interesting to learn. And also it was helpful later on in thinking about the barriers that the team had, because there comes a point where the team becomes very integrated and united, but early on it was very hard, and language was definitely a big kind of barrier between certain segments of the team. And so just navigating that kind of language aspect, it was something that took a lot of tweaking for me to kind of get a grasp on.
Yeah, I love how you conveyed that in the book. And I can totally understand that hesitation, because even if I'm at, say, the Korean restaurant down the street, I can get nervous to even, say the basic words. There's a bit of self-consciousness and imposter syndrome and whatnot. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Something that really struck me as I was, reading articles about you and prep for all of this was that your first trip home was in reporting all of this, and that our first trip home for intercountry adoptees is such a big deal. So how was that, how those two big things coinciding, your first trip home with such a big writing job, how was that experience for you?
It was, it was a very stressful time, but I don't look at it stressful in a bad way. It was just, there was a lot going on. And so one of the key parts of the book is, as some people may remember, in 2018, late 2017, when North Korea, South Korea relations were really fragile and then kind of came together before the Winter Olympics that year, they eventually made the South Korean women's hockey team into a unified team with players from North Korea. And so that had just happened literally like 2 weeks before I went to South Korea. And so that was, worldwide news at the point. And I was trying to figure out ways of, one, how to incorporate this sudden new peg into the book. You have, players from North Korea, and also in terms of access, like, will I be able to talk to them? And another challenge on top of that was the players on the South Korean team essentially were put like in a bubble after that, because they knew that media around the world would just kind of be hunting them down. And prior to that, it was very easy to text or email players on the team. And so they were just being really watched over in a way now that they had this North Korean component. And so it was a little bit harder to even communicate with players that I had been talking to for over a year at that point. I remember actually setting up through like text once I was in South Korea on the ground. One of the players like, oh, can we meet? And she had to essentially like sneak out of the Olympic Village to like meet me in a coffee shop for 30 minutes. But to go back to your question about, going there and the emotions, I remember on the way there, and people had told me, it was actually some players on the team, some of the Korean American players, when they made, for a lot of them, their first trip back was when they went to go train with the team for the first time. And some of them did talk about like getting this sensation or just kind of this feeling as they were landing in Korea, as they flew over and saw the mountains, and this idea that, oh, they were coming home in a sense. I didn't have any moment like that. And I still feel like, even though I've been twice, I went twice in 2018, since both times were very heavily work center trips, I didn't get a lot of time to kind of let it all soak in, so to speak. And I do wish that I had that more kind of immersive moment. It was just so much was going on related to the book and working that I didn't have time to maybe think and reflect that much. But one thing also in terms of going back that I was pretty aware of and had tried to be sort of, delicate about, is the idea of, one, not speaking Korean myself. So everything was very heavily centered on being able to speak English. And so a lot of the experience that I did have when I had time to explore Seoul or other places was going to these very heavily expat areas. And so I know that kind of slants or skews a perspective when you're visiting any kind of foreign country. And so there definitely is a hope for me on my part to be able to take a trip that I'm just able to more so be free from any kind of professional restraints and go beyond those kind of comfort zone areas.
Yeah, I really hope you get that experience too. And now when you do get a chance to go, you'll already have had this experience of it not being quite as daunting, because you've flown there, you've walked the streets and had the experience of the aromas and whatnot. So maybe it'll be just a whole new thing for you. So I wanted to go to Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
You have a really great way of showing how the personal is the political. You've tackled many big projects and topics such as being adopted and pro-choice, the violence against Asian women, and Hollywood's entitlement. So what would you like to read for us today?
So I'm going to read the conclusion to an essay that I wrote in HuffPost Personal about being adopted and pro-choice. I wrote it back in May 2019, but sadly it is still a timely issue, especially in Texas, where I live currently and where I was raised. And it was a response to a lot of the debates on both sides, using adoptees and adoption as an alternative to abortion, questions when I would speak out about my views about whether I would rather have been aborted than adopted, and that conflation. So my reading is, after my birth father died, my birth mother, who referred to herself as a badly born person in her letter, tried to find me. But since he had handled all of the original adoption paperwork, agencies wouldn't help her. Even after meeting me and having received confirmation that I did indeed live a happy life, my birth mother's shame was overwhelming and palpable. During the week I stayed with them in Korea, she couldn't bring herself to look me in the eye. Almost daily, she would say, "Mianhe, I'm sorry." Do I wish she had aborted me instead? That is not a fair question to ask of anyone, and yet people feel empowered to ask it of adoptees. I wish a lot of things for my birth mother. I wish she had married a kinder man, or had the financial security and societal support to leave him when he abused her and my sisters. I wish adoption had truly been her decision rather than his preference. I wish she hadn't lived so many years with crippling guilt. I wish that post-adoption services were more resourceful so it wouldn't have taken so long to find her and assuage some of that guilt. The point is not whether I'm grateful my birth mother didn't abort me. It is that she deserved to make her own choice. My existence was not for me to decide, nor was I entitled to be here. Nevertheless, I am here and I have a voice. It is my choice now what to do with it.
Wow, that's really powerful. I've read that a couple times and I just got chills just hearing you read it yourself. There's just so much, again, just tying the personal to the political so well. And that one was in the Huffington Post, was it? Yeah. So you've had a lot of publishing success. So I would love to hear what led to your decision to start your own platform with Visible Magazine.
So the secret to my publishing success and the inspiration for Visible came from the same source. So I was really fortunate to be part of a fellowship called the Public Voices Fellowship through the Op-Ed Project. So they're a nonprofit organization in New York, and their mission is to increase the thought leadership of women and people from underrepresented communities, specifically through op-ed writing. And so I was given training on how to write an op-ed. I was given help from mentor editors in pitching the pieces. So that essay was part of the fellowship. But simultaneously, as I was finding success, I was also running into challenges, and I was seeing the challenges and the obstacles that the other women in my cohort were facing. And these were executive directors, CEOs, like experts in their field. And they were being told by editors, well, if you don't have a PhD, it's going to be really hard for me to publish you. And I think our fellowship facilitators were seeing some of our frustration, and they actually brought in the opinion editor from our local legacy news organization. And we did a live pitch session, and we each went around the table and shared our pitches. And her response afterwards was, well, just so you know, my subscriber base is middle-class white men. So unless you can tailor your pitch to interest them, I'm going to have difficulty placing your pieces. And at that point, I think adoptees are used to being in spaces that weren't designed for us, that people don't know what to do with us. And I was tired of fighting to have my story told and watching people being told that they weren't expert enough. And so because I had experience working in the blogging and influencer space, I did web design, I had creative platforms for other people. I actually went home that night after our fellowship convening and created Visible. I bought the domain, had somebody design a logo for me, and I just let people know that it was there. And it started out just having people from the fellowship spinning their pieces, friends of mine, and word sort of spread. And it's now in its third year almost, and we've published more than 250 different authors' pieces, and it's been incredible.
That is so awesome. I love the whole empowering ourselves instead of begging for a seat at the table. So what kind of plans do you have for this platform?
So the difficult thing is I've been operating, doing that in my spare time. So I have a full-time job as the communications director for a racial equity organization. So I've been waking up early and getting pitches in my email, getting it scheduled, then going to work. And I haven't had time to even brainstorm what's next for it. And so I've actually decided to resign from my full-time job. The end of this month is my last day, so that I can be more intentional and start thinking about ways that I can fund this and make it sustainable beyond me, and make sure that writers are paid, because I haven't been able to do that before. And I'm also starting a new organization locally, an Asian American Historical Society for Dallas, which is inspired a lot by my experience as an adoptee. Marcus Garvey, and Jamaican activist, said that a people without knowledge of their history and their origin are like people without roots. I think I just messed up that quote, but it's like a tree without roots. That's it. And so that rootlessness is something that I felt not only as an adoptee, but as an Asian American in Texas, in the South. And so I'm going to sort of use my passion for storytelling and history in that way as well.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, from myself, I've had to do a lot of my own studying, seek out my own curriculum. So yeah, I love that. And I think this is a good time to open it up to everybody because all four of us have multiple marginalized identities, and we work in a field that's still reportedly 85% white. And just like what you're saying, some of the challenges that I've had are feeling either that hearing that my stories aren't relatable enough, or feeling like my traumas are being exploited for clicks. So that's not a great space to be begging to be in. And add to that, many of us were raised in environments where speaking our truth was seen as such an offense or just outright denied. So given all of that, how does it feel to be writing from and about your identity? Anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, for me, writing about my identity feels empowering because I'm making a space for me to share my experience, and being able to connect that to like news events and just share and advocate for adoptees, especially adoptees of color. It just feels like I'm taking charge where I didn't have a voice before. And I find that that's very like cathartic too. So, but it also can be taxing. Whenever I see something that makes me passionate enough to like write an essay and pitch it, you know, like inevitably sending it to so many editors until it gets picked up, or in case it doesn't, you know, that's a lot of work emotionally to like put my experience in the spotlight and then share it to the world. And so it's kind of two-sided.
Yeah, and that's before all the comments.
Yes.
Yeah, speaking of comments, you know, putting out a piece about being pro-choice or having any kind of criticism of adoption as a system, something that helped me was a quote from the Op-Ed Project's founder, Katie Ornstein, and she says that if you say something of consequence, there may be consequences. The alternative is to be inconsequential. So when I started being very vulnerable on a larger scale about my story, I always thought about the risk. And it was always outweighed by the fact that my story could help somebody that needed to hear it, because I was that person growing up that felt like I was so alone. I was so strange. And there was something wrong with me, that if I had read something that affirmed my experience and showed its connection to a larger system, you know, it could have helped me infinitely. And so I think about the consequences and the trolling comments, but the fact that it might reach one person who needed to hear it at that moment is worth it to me.
Yes, definitely. That's honestly the most rewarding aspect of it for me. What about you, Seth? Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that I've kind of picked up in like a professional standpoint is not so much from my perspective, but when, you know, interviewing or reporting on or talking to people who may be adopted. Obviously, there was Marissa in the book, and then a lot of my background before has been kind of like a sports writer, and I've come across other athletes who are adopted as well. And so in talking to them, obviously I felt like a little bit of, you know, it provided me maybe sort of like an entryway that obviously other people may not have, just in kind of having the experience. But one thing that I've always tried to do is be very sensitive to that person's just kind of their own experience and their perspective. A few people have, you know, said a very similar thing where they're like, if you're I guess, a person of celebrity or well-known or have you, there's a lot of people who obviously relate to you, but there's also a lot of pressure, I think, that comes with people, where it can almost become overwhelming in a way where people look to you for this kind of, to be the symbol or something. And it can be, people have told me, like, it's very tricky because they want to be respectful to everybody's experience. And also, it helps to be that kind of beacon, or to inspire someone. That's very something they take very seriously, but it's also a lot of pressure. Like, I've seen, following Marissa, the character in my book, I remember just she became like really overwhelmed and burnt out because, like, during the Olympics, her adoption story became this NBC, CNN, CBS, literally every station you could think of wanted to do a story about her coming to her home country. And it was literally just nonstop interview, asking the same questions. And I did get a chance to talk with her later about that, about how that just really became overwhelming. And so I really admire people like, the keynote speaker later today, Nicole Chung, who's really been able to take up the mantle and be very open and relatable to people, but also in kind of the other side in journalism, when you're, interviewing and subjects and sources are from, an adopted background, it just kind of be intricate and one learning about their own perspective and how, they kind of view how they project themselves, or how they maybe want to project themselves out to the world.
Yeah, and as you were saying earlier, our arcs happen at different times, at different stages of life. For a long time, I didn't feel safe to explore, my adoption identity, adoptee identity, and my Asian identity and whatnot. So for all of us, it happens at different times. So we do want to be respectful of that too. So I want to ask another question. This one might be a little bit controversial, but as you were saying, Seth, we have room for all kinds of views here. Do you feel there's an ethical way for non-adopted people to tell adoptee-centered stories? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is definitely controversial. It's funny because I just posted about, I have two adoptive parents friends that wrote recent books. One kind of like a parenting book like my book, but in a more Christian perspective, and another a picture book. And immediately there was controversy on Instagram about like whether or not these adoptive parents had the right to share these stories. And often I'm very critical of adoptive parents who are writing from these perspectives. But I think there is a place, a very small place, where this can be done ethically if handled very carefully. And that involves including beta readers and sensitivity readers by adoptees, paying adoptees for their labor if you're interviewing and including their work, and making sure that if you're sharing a story that's not just about you, that's about your adopted child, that you're checking in with them, that they're old enough to kind of actually give consent without the pressure of wanting to please their adoptive parent. And so I think this is something that should be handled very carefully, but I think there is a place if handled gently.
Anybody else want to add their thoughts on this?
I would find difficulty with any adoptive parent writing an adoptee-centered story, not having sort of a biased lens in their approach. What I do think is possible is non-adopted people who are coming from a very journalistic, research-based, using primary sources, and as Melissa said, compensating people who are interviewed, giving them proper credit and attribution. But I think my question is always why? Why are you using adoptee and adoption as a plot line or as a topic? And is it self-serving in some way? Or is it truly for the benefit of adoptees?
I think both of you raised a really important aspect here, compensation. because I know there are a lot of adoptive parents and just people in general, writers in general, who follow us on our social media accounts, and they're writing a book. And so we're being used as free research, and then I rarely credited, if at all. So that is, I think, exploitative. So I would love to see compensation be involved, included when there is a non-adopted person spearheading a project. What about you, Seth? What's your opinion on this?
That's really interesting. You could say a bit of a Neanderthal, or maybe pretty smart for not being too active on social media. But no, I mean, just hearing that people could kind of do that, like mine information, that obviously rubs me a certain kind of way. I do think it can be done. You know, it shows when someone takes the time and effort into kind of researching and giving just due in their reporting and their work. There was a story recently, came out maybe last month or 2 months ago. The writer Tammy Kim, Korean American writer, she wrote this story kind of about adoption and adoption stories that, you know, I felt was just, you know, well researched, and she did a good job in kind of giving voices to adopted writers, you know, to give their perspective. I think that's kind of, as you're kind of hinting on there, like it is really important. Like if you're gonna write about it, you know, obviously use sources and use people who can provide that firsthand perspective, and also different kind of perspectives about adoption as well. You know, if I was to come across someone and someone just kind of locked in or honed in on this one very super traumatic kind of aspect of it, to obviously bring emotion and readership and get a lot of clicks or attention to it, you know, obviously would find something with that. And I think, as we were talking a little bit about before, like being able to find that and recognize just the nuance and the different backgrounds and stories that a lot of people have is key and fundamental. But, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely, I think, a tricky subject, but one that hopefully over time, and people like yourself, Gia, being able to call out in a way people who do things that are unethical or just sort of like cringy or whatever, definitely helps kind of maybe evolve it to a point where people will take it from a more professional and well-rounded kind of perspective.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go to the Q&A section from the audience. And let's see. Let's ask. Anonymous asks, how can we cultivate a space to write research about transracial adoption, both on a personal and professional level? Who would like to answer that one? I suppose Stephanie sort of answered part of that, didn't you, when talking about visible?
Yeah, so one of the things I think is that when it comes to research, people look at our community as a statistically insignificant population because we are such a small number in the grand scheme of things. And I think by sharing our personal stories and creating space for that, it's harder for people to ignore our presence when we're vocal about our experiences, when we start connecting the dots. And I think instead of it being the other way around, where research is driving more personal stories, the sharing of stories is actually going to spark interest of researchers to dig deep. And once they start seeing the patterns across our stories, it'll be of interest.
That kind of ties into another question asking, what do you all think of social media as a tool to share our stories? How do we create boundaries with ourselves and others on these public platforms? And this is from Anika, I think, or Annika.
I think social media is such a powerful tool, especially in this day and age. We can get information out there so much faster than we can I say pitching articles because it takes a lot of time to do that writing. But I think we have to be very cognizant of what we are putting out there and our boundaries, because it's very open and you have to realize that you are putting this out into the world where something can be viral and you not mean it to be, and then there's a lot of feedback, good, bad, not, somewhere in the middle, that you're going to get. And if you're not ready to share that with the world, maybe don't make a profile that's public, and just definitely sit on something before you just put it out there. I think it's very valuable for educating adoptive parents, adoptive family members, and just connecting with other adoptees. The first place that I was able to connect and, make adoptee friends was Facebook. And without that, I think I would have been ignorant to the community that we have. And it's such a strong and welcoming place. And social media makes that possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've grown up with social media, the MySpace days, Zynga. I was in college when Facebook first started. So I see social media as not only a place to connect and to build relationships and feel less alone, but it's a really important tool to disrupt some of those traditional sort of legacy outlets that I talked about earlier, and institutions. For example, I was having a little bit of a conflict and some feelings of rejection when I did not get accepted into a PhD program that I applied to. It was a history program. And then I realized I already have a platform to share the history that I find. I don't necessarily need that institution to tell the stories and to raise awareness. I've been blessed to grow a larger following. And I think social media is a way to kind of subvert some of those gatekeeping entities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard Ali Henny talk about how social media has been huge for her in terms of growing an audience, especially when we're from marginalized identities and the gatekeepers only want certain types of stories. So yeah, that's great. I'm in full support of that. So we have a question about if anyone wants to share any specific criticism that they've received from readers. Seth, do you have any, being a predominantly sports writer, but you also wrote this book, have you heard anything that's been difficult?
I didn't hear anything particularly related to the adoption angle or the adopted characters in my book. Before I kind of answer that, I also just wanted to touch on the previous questions a little bit. And Melissa kind of mentioned some good points. And I also wanted to add on top of that it's also very helpful to reach out to people. For example, when I was starting like promotion for my book, I contacted Alice, who's one of the founders of this festival. And Alice has a great book about adoption, which is a good starting point, I think, for a lot of people doing research or just wanting to learn more. And she and other people that I met along the way have always been very open and very willing to help. I remember I had an event in DC and she came and I got to meet her there briefly. And that, I think, just kind of shows the welcoming, the welcome, environment that a lot of people like to create and foster stories that, they may be familiar with. And so I would, if you're looking to tell your own story and maybe thinking of ways to get out, find research people, Alice, who has definitely been very open in helping people out and just not being afraid to kind of, seek that kind of advice or what have you from people. Obviously, a lot of you are doing that if you're coming to this kind of panel today. But one of the more, I guess you could say, like heartwarming things about this was, one, before I started writing my book, never really being involved in any kind of adoption community, but seeing a lot of cordiality and people just very open and willing to help in a lot of ways. And I think that kind of is one thing that spreads a lot throughout, various groups, demographics, et cetera, in this community. I don't know, maybe someone else has a better, probably could answer the conflict or the criticism question a bit better. I'll think if anything comes to mind, but
I think to add to what you just said, community is so important. You know, I totally feel like I wouldn't have half the knowledge that I have on adoption or, you know, my identity as an Asian woman had it not been for tapping into community 15 years ago. That question I just noticed about criticism was actually directed towards Melissa. Did you want to answer that?
Yeah, so a lot of the criticism I get is that adoptees should be grateful, especially like me, for being adopted by a family in America, that I was afforded greater privileges, and if it wasn't for adoption, the thing that I'm talking about in a critical way, I would be somewhere in a ditch or other various horrible things. And the criticism kind of lies upon that, or people get really defensive for my adoptive parents. They'll be like, how dare you share that story, you're just trying to do that to clickbait and to get famous and this and that. And it's just so funny to me because my adoptive parents are very open about adoption and they don't always agree with me, but my mom's my biggest supporter. She wrote the forward in my book. So it's just funny to me because people will find any excuse to get angry about discussing adoption in something that isn't a positive way. And I call it like the toxic positivity that I get more into my book. But basically, if you say anything that's against that, you're going to get some type of criticism. So just know that and try to have a very strong support network that will be there for you and that you can vent and protect yourself.
I echo all of the ungrateful, your parents must be ashamed, but my parents are very supportive. Another thing that I've noticed is sort of the whatabouts or the but from parents that say, well, my adopted child has never experienced racism, so racism can't possibly exist. And so that is why I always try to tie my personal with the larger picture, with history, with systemic racism and institutionalized issues, because there's a lot of that erasure of just my experience is different or someone I know had a different experience, and it's not a zero-sum game.
Totally. Thank you so much for all of your candid responses. Before we close out, I wanted to ask, how can people get in touch and follow your work? Melissa?
You can go to my website, adopteethoughts.com. I have an Instagram, same name, Adoptee Thoughts. Everything should be linked there. And my book, I'm pretty sure you guys have the link for everybody's books too.
Great. Seth?
yeah, you can visit my website, which is sethberkman.com.
And Stephanie?
Yes, stephaniedrenka.com and at Stephanie Drenka on social media. Not very creative in terms of the names, so you can find me there, and it's links to every other organization I'm affiliated with.
Thank you. And I can be found at gsonly.com. So I think that is our time, and Marcy and Alice wanted to come back and close us out properly and tell you about the other panels and the book, how to buy our books.
Thank you so much for such a stunning panel to kick off our festival. I cannot imagine a better conversation to situate us. On behalf of the festival, thank you all, Stephanie and Seth and Gia and Melissa. And thank you all for listening. Our next panel is at 12:45. It's a middle grade and young adult literature panel featuring Kosako Jackson, Meredith Ireland, Mariama J. Lockington, moderated by Sanyang Shin. Please do support these authors by purchasing all of their books or multiple copies of their books and giving them to everyone in your life through loyalty bookstores. They have made a special page for the festival. You can buy all of the presenting authors' books through them throughout the day, and they'll ship them to wherever you are around the world. And then we do also want to mention this festival has been a labor of love by Alice and me, but we have been hearing from folks who are interested in donating. Is totally not expected. We are currently only set up for Venmo, but if you are so moved, we are grateful. It does help us offset costs and send out free books to folks. If you haven't already seen in our social media giveaways, that thank you for the authors for donating copies. And then lastly, we are constantly creating a list of additional resources for folks. We've been seeing in the Q&A boxes and all across social media that you're sharing your own stories. So we would love to add you to our additional resources list. Melissa's podcast is on there. Everyone's books will be on there. So please visit our website for more information. And we hope to see you throughout the day. Alice, any last words before we close out?
No, just thank you for the panelists. Thank you for your honesty and your advice. It just a great way to start off. I really appreciate it, and especially for you on the Pacific time, getting up early for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you guys.
Everyone.